There are men who carry other men's secrets the way old walls carry water stains, quietly, without explanation, long after the source has dried up and disappeared. Ray Manzarek was one of those men, and Jim Morrison was the source he never fully explained to anyone. For decades, the world believed it understood Jim Morrison. The leather pants, the whiskey bottle, the poetry, the riot, the myth so polished by repetition that even the people who had been closest to him began to mistake the surface for the truth. But Ray Manzarek, the quiet architect behind the keys, the man who had co-founded the Doors on a Venice Beach conversation and a shared dream, Ray knew something the world did not. He had heard Jim Morrison cry once, just once, and he had carried that sound inside him for the rest of his life without ever once offering it to an interviewer, a biographer, or a journalist hungry for detail. What makes a man guard a moment like that? What does it mean to protect the vulnerability of someone the entire world believed was invincible? The answer, if it exists at all, begins not at the end, but somewhere in the middle of everything. In the years when both men were young enough to believe that music could hold every feeling a human being was capable of producing. Ray Manzarek first met Jim Morrison in the summer of 1965 on the sand at Venice Beach in Los Angeles. Morrison was 21 years old. He was thin, sun-dark, carrying a notebook filled with poems he had written on the rooftop of a film school building where he had been living alone for weeks. Ray was slightly older, already trained in classical piano, already searching for the place where formal discipline and raw expression could meet without either destroying the other. The meeting was casual by most accounts, two young men talking about music and poetry in the afternoon light. But something crystallized in that conversation that neither man would fully be able to articulate for years. Ray asked Jim if he had any songs. Jim recited a poem from memory, something strange and cinematic, full of imagery that felt borrowed from ancient mythology and Los Angeles at the same time. Ray listened, and then quietly, he began to hear the melody underneath the words. That was the beginning. Not a business decision, not a calculated move, a recognition, the kind that only comes between two people when something real is being exchanged without either of them entirely meaning to. What they were each searching for at that moment, only they could have said. But the music they were about to make together suggested that both of them were looking for the same thing. A language that could hold the kind of feeling that ordinary life had no words for. And that was where the distance between them and the closeness between them began at exactly the same moment. The Doors formed quickly, as the best things sometimes do. Ray brought in Robbie Krieger on guitar and John Densmore on drums. The four of them rehearsed in a small space, learning each other's instincts, learning what happened when Morrison's words met Manzarek's organ lines. The sound that emerged was unlike anything else moving through Los Angeles at the time. Darker, more literary, more theatrical. It refused to be simply a rock band. It refused to be simply a poetry reading. It existed in a space between categories that no existing label quite fit. Ray was the musical foundation. He was the one who held the structure steady when Morrison pushed toward the edges of it. And Morrison pushed constantly, not always with intention, not always with calculation, but with a restless need that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than performance instinct. He pushed because standing still felt to him like a kind of death. The early success came faster than most people remembered years later. By 1967, The Doors had a #1 single, a debut album that was being studied as seriously as it was being danced to, and a frontman who was being written about in language more commonly reserved for poets and philosophers than rock musicians. Jim Morrison was 23 years old and already being described as a generation's voice. But the real story was never only in the music. Ray Manzarek watched Jim Morrison from a closer distance than almost anyone else during those years. He watched him in rehearsal, when the songs were still being built and the pressure was low, and Morrison moved through the room with the kind of ease that suggested the stage persona had not yet fully colonized the man. He watched him in recording sessions, the long nights in the studio, the tape rolling and the cigarette smoke thickening in the air, Morrison standing at the microphone with his eyes half closed and his hands loose at his sides, fishing for whatever lived underneath the surface of a lyric. He watched him backstage before shows, the transformation that happened in the 20 minutes before Jim Morrison walked out in front of an audience. The way the ordinary-looking young man from Florida slowly became something else entirely, something that had no name in any ordinary human catalog. And he watched what happened after the shows. That was what most people never saw. The performance ended and the crowd poured out into the night, carrying pieces of the experience with them. And Jim Morrison walked off the stage, and the transformation reversed itself. The voltage left his eyes. The certainty left his posture. He became, again, the young man with the notebook and the questions that had no clean answers. The one who had been living on a rooftop, writing poems that no one had yet heard. Ray saw all of it. He never said much about what he saw. That discretion was its own kind of loyalty. But there was something no one in the room could see during those years. The thing Ray kept and never surrendered. It was sometime in 1968, though Ray was never specific about the season. The Doors were in the middle of a period of intense work, recording, touring, the relentless momentum of a band at the peak of its commercial power. The nights were long. The shows were enormous. The world, outside the music, was fracturing in ways that even people who were not paying close attention could feel. The assassinations, the protests, the cities burning, the sense that the decade had promised something it was no longer certain it could deliver. Morrison was drinking more heavily by that point. That was not a secret. The people close to him saw it and felt the worry of it, the helpless quality of watching someone you cared about moving towards something you could not intercept. Ray was worried. Robbie was worried. John was worried. The worry lived in the rooms with them the way certain sounds live in old buildings. Always present, rarely named directly. One night, after a show, the city has never been clearly identified, and perhaps Ray chose not to identify it for reasons of his own. Morrison did not go out with the others. He did not move toward the party, the crowd, the usual orbit of people who gathered around him in the hours after a performance. He stayed in the dressing room. He sat on the floor with his back against the wall and his knees drawn up, and he was quiet in a way that was different from the other kinds of quiet Ray had seen in him over the years. Ray stayed too. He did not ask anything. He did not try to fill the silence with reassurance or analysis or the ordinary social mechanics that people use to manage each other's discomfort. He simply stayed. And then, at some point in that stillness, Jim Morrison began to cry. Not dramatically, not with the theatrical violence that his stage presence might have suggested. Quietly, without apparent intention. The kind of crying that surfaces when a person has been holding something back for a long time, and the body simply decides, without consulting anyone, that the holding is over for now. Ray sat with that. He did not move closer. He did not speak. He did not reach for anything to offer. He just stayed in the room. That was all. And somehow, that was everything. Morrison did not speak about what had surfaced that night. Ray did not ask. In the morning, things continued as they always had. The music, the road, the machinery of a career that did not slow down for private grief. But something had passed between the two of them in that room that did not require words and that did not need to be discussed to be understood. The applause was always real. So was the silence afterward. What is it that a man like Jim Morrison carried that could produce that kind of silence? The people who have written about him most carefully over the decades have circled this question without ever quite landing on an answer that feels complete. The distance from his father, the Navy admiral who represented exactly the kind of authority Morrison had built his entire artistic identity in opposition to. The sense of being known by millions of people and understood by almost none of them. The strange psychic cost of being a symbol before you have finished becoming a person. The loneliness that lives specifically inside enormous public warmth. The kind of loneliness you cannot explain to anyone who has not felt it, because from the outside it looks like the opposite of loneliness. Morrison once said, in a way that people have quoted many times without always understanding its weight, that he was interested in anything about revolt, disorder, chaos. But what the quote left out, what the context sometimes swallowed, was the rest of the sentence, the rest of what he meant, which was something closer to, he was interested in those things because they described the inside of his own head, and making art out of them was the only method he had found for managing them without being destroyed. Ray understood this, not because Jim had told him directly, but because Ray had been close enough, long enough, to read the architecture of it. And that was where the weight of what Ray carried began to make a different kind of sense. The Doors continued for 3 more years after that night. There were more albums, more tours, more moments of transcendent performance, and more moments of painful, visible unraveling. Morrison moved to Paris in 1971. He was 27 years old, tired, wanting space from the name he had become, hoping that distance might give him back something that the machinery of his own celebrity had gradually consumed. He was writing poetry again, seriously and privately, in a way that felt to those closest to him like a return to the beginning, to the young man on the roof with the notebook and the questions. He died in Paris in July of 1971. He was 27 years old. Ray Manzarek learned of it across an ocean, the way people learn of the worst things, suddenly, without preparation, with no context adequate to the size of what had happened. He did not speak publicly about the night in the dressing room. Not then, not later, not in the many years of interviews, in documentaries, in retrospective conversations about the band, about Jim, about what it all had meant. He talked about the music with great love and great precision. He talked about Morrison's genius with the quiet certainty of a man who had watched it from an arm's length away. He talked about the loss with the restraint of someone who understood that some grief is too specific and too personal to be translated into the general currency of public mourning. But the night in the dressing room, that stayed his. Some people who knew Ray well in his later years have suggested, carefully and without claiming too much, that the memory of that night was something he returned to more often than he let on. That in the long aftermath of Morrison's death, through the decades of keeping the band's legacy alive, through the interviews and the tributes and the continued presence of those songs in the world's imagination, Ray sometimes seemed to be holding something specifically and carefully, the way a person holds an object that cannot be replaced if dropped. What was it about that particular moment that he chose to keep? Perhaps it was simply this. In a story that had been told so many times in so many directions, in a myth that had grown so large it had begun to obscure the human being at its center, that night in the dressing room was the realest thing. The moment when Jim Morrison was not a symbol, or a shaman, or a legend, or a cautionary tale. The moment when he was simply a young man sitting on a floor, carrying more than he could carry alone, in the presence of someone who knew not to make it into anything more than what it was. Ray Manzarek never gave that moment to the world, and in keeping it, he gave Morrison something no biographer, no documentary, no legend-making machine ever could. He gave him privacy. He gave him the dignity of a moment that belonged only to the two of them. And when Ray Manzarek died in 2013, quietly, from cancer, far from any stage, he took that night with him. What passed between them in that room is gone now, sealed in the way that only the truly private moments of a life are finally sealed. Not by secrecy or suppression, but by the simple fact that the last person who fully remembered it is no longer here to tell it. The songs remain, the voice remains, recorded and preserved, still capable of reaching into something specific and unnameable in the people who hear it. And somewhere underneath all of it, underneath the leather and the mythology and the decades of interpretation, there is a young man sitting on a floor in a dressing room in 1968 in a city that was never named, crying quietly while his friends stayed close and said nothing. That is the part of the story that was never told. That is the part that was always the truest.